The first thing Miss Marple noticed was the hush. It was 3 o'clock, and inside the tea and comfort shop, the scent of fresh scones and steeping Earl Grey drifted through the polished wooden tables. Outside, the sun cast long golden streaks over the cobbled streets, making the painted signboard gleam, cozy conversations and fresh scones. But within the shop, all conversation had dulled to murmurs. Miss Marple, seated by the window as was her custom, stirred her tea with a deliberate slowness. Her kindly blue eyes, sharper than they seemed, flicked across the room, noting the furtive glances, the tension laced beneath the town gossip. Something was amiss. She didn't have to wait long to hear what it was. Across from her, Mr. Pickering, an elderly man with a mustache, so grand it nearly hid his mouth, muttered over his fruitcake. His voice, though low, carried just enough urgency to reach her ears. "Wisterfield Hall's rearing its head again," he muttered, shaking his head. "Blasted place, always something dark lurking about. A solicitor's been sniffing around. Some old unsolved murder come back to haunt them." A sharp inhale came from Mrs. Watkins, the town's most enthusiastic purveyor of scandal. She leaned in, eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement. "The family curse," she whispered, her jeweled brooch catching the sunlight as she shuddered theatrically. "It goes back generations. Tragedies, one after another. Mysterious deaths, strange disappearances. That house is cursed, I tell you. Hardly a year passes without some misfortune." Miss Marple remained still, but inside, her mind was the Wisterfield Curse. She had heard that name before. A memory, dusty and faded, flickered in the back of her mind. Hushed whispers in her youth about the Wisterfield family's endless misfortunes, deaths that never quite made sense, accidents that seemed anything but. And now, after all these years, the whispers had returned. She took a slow sip of tea, her gaze catching their reflections in the shop's large window. Mr. Pickering and Mrs. Watkins spoke in conspiratorial tones, every so often sneaking glances her way, as if wanting her to overhear, but not daring to speak directly. Then Mrs. Watkins dropped a name, Mr. Pendleton, old solicitor from Morchester, her voice lifted just enough for Miss Marple to catch. "He's been asking around for discreet help, a real observational type," she smirked. "Some say Miss Marple might fit the bill." Miss Marple set her cup down with a soft clink. Discreet help, an interesting choice of words. In St. Mary Mead, people always needed help untangling little puzzles, a misplaced brooch, a missing letter, a curious visitor, but a solicitor investigating a family curse? That was a horse of an entirely different color. From behind the counter, Mrs. Summers, the proprietress, clinked teacups while stealing curious glances toward Miss Marple. She merely nodded politely, and turned her thoughts inward. She had heard whispers of something nasty at Wisterfield Hall once before. Dolly Bantry, an old friend, had spoken in hushed tones of unexplained, echoing through locked corridors. A distant relative found dead under bizarre circumstances. A locked room, a body inside. No visible way in, no way out, and one name lingered. The Wisterfield Curse? Miss Marple glanced around the cozy tea shop, taking in the floral wallpaper, the hum of conversation, the buttery scent of warm pastries. It was all so comfortingly ordinary, but she knew better. Even the prettiest villages harbored the deepest secrets. The city had its crimes, its sharp-edged cynicism, but here, murder could lurk behind lace curtains, poison could be stirred into a cup of tea, and deception could be sewn into the fabric of everyday life. A few tables over, a woman with frizzy hair half whispered, "If Mr. Pendleton's involved, it must be serious. That family's tragedies, they never did make sense." The words rattled through Miss Marple's orderly mind. A murder that had never been solved, a solicitor digging into the past, and the family haunted by the same fate for generations. She tapped her spoon against the porcelain rim of her cup. Soft, thoughtful, decisive. If Mr. Pendleton was hunting for help, then this was not just a dusty old rumor. It was a matter of real consequence, and if that was the case, Miss Marple believed one thing above all: truth seldom remains hidden where inquisitive eyes persist. Outside, an automobile sputtered past, breaking the hush inside the shop. The villagers shifted, their conversations turning to more everyday matters. But for Miss Marple, a new mystery had just begun, and mysteries, as she well knew, had a way of finding her. Concerns upkeep of gardens, whether the vicar's sermon ran too long, that sort of trifling, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. Her keen glance took stock of every subtle reaction. She noted the hush that fell whenever the Wisterfield name crossed someone's lips. Nerves, anticipation, possibly even fear. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin. Then regarded the tea shop once more. This was her routine after all: tea and a slice of village chatter. It wasn't a lively big city nightlife, but from a certain angle it was far more revealing. People let details slip in a place like this, lulled by the presence of cream cake, in the everyday rising gracefully. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and smoothed the front of her skirt. Quiet satisfaction nudging the corners of her smile. A solicitor seeking her assistance in a long-buried family scandal that sounded like a perfect end to an otherwise ordinary Wednesday afternoon. And if the Wisterfield Curse was resurrecting its old theatrics, well, that was quite the clue to chase down. She paid her bill and stepped out onto the cobblestone lane, a mild breeze rustling her neat white hair. The quiet of St. Mary May enveloped her, but she carried the faint echo of rumor with her, a secret thread soon to be pulled across the street. Two villagers watched her go. They might have wondered what mild Miss Marple found so interesting in all this talk of curses but Miss Marple herself had no question about it. Nothing stirred her curiosity like hearing that someone somewhere had a puzzle that needed solving. The express carriage from St. Mary May rattled into Morchester just past 10 in the morning. A watery sun cast half-hearted light on the bustling thoroughfare, where motor cars mingled with horse-drawn cabs. An era in flux. Miss Marple stepped onto the pavement with measured composure, taking in the swirl of city life, before turning down a quiet lane, its cobblestones damp from a recent drizzle. At the end of that lane stood an Edwardian row building with a polished brass plate that read Pendleton and Sons Solicitors. She entered the reception area, to find it hush, lit only by a single window left ajar for fresh air. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, underscoring the place's sense of orderly gravity. An efficient-looking clerk peered up from his ledger and rose, greeting her with courtesy. "This way, Miss Marple," he said, leading her down a short hallway. "Mr. Pendleton is expecting you inside the solicitor's office." The scent of well-oiled leather and old paper greeted her. Mahogany shelves lined the walls, tightly packed with volumes of law reports, all carefully labeled in neat gold lettering. Mr. Pendleton himself was of medium height and unassuming build, grey at the temples, neatly combed hair, and an air of mild agitation beneath his polished civility. He offered Miss Marple a seat by his desk, where a green-shaded lamp accentuated the lingering shadows in the corners of the room. The single window behind him allowed a modest shaft of morning light to cut across a scattering of documents. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he began, voice at a conspiratorial hush. "Do apologize for any imposition." Miss Marple's eyes traced the precise angles of his workspace, each paper stacked meticulously, no stray pen or ink blot in sight, a place of order she thought that seldom played host to talk of supernatural curses. "Not at all, Mr. Pendleton," she replied gently. "I understand you have certain concerns regarding Wisterfield Hall." Her mention of the estate's name brought a slight contraction of his shoulders. He folded his hands atop the desk. "Imagine you've heard the rumors that house and that family." He paused, glancing at the door as though it might have ears of its own. "Let's call it a history of untimely misfortune." Miss Marple nodded with polite neutrality. "Some whisper it's a curse." He let out a breath that might have been a half laugh. "If it wasn't so serious. Yes, the cursed Wisterfields with their superstitions and their secrets. I've personally never given credence to ghosts or hexes, but the talk has persisted for decades, and a particularly tragic event, well, it remains unresolved in the year 1000,922 to be specific." A muscle twitched in his jaw, as he opened a leather-bound folder on his desk. Inside were yellowed pages, the corners curled and worn, But now this he slid a fragment of paper toward Miss Marple, an old diary entry, the ink faint but still legible enough to mention fearful crimes. She held the delicate sheet between her gloved fingers, scraps of a personal account, scrawled in a firm feminine hand. Too many accidents to be charged once. We must keep the truth hidden, or so I am told. The words carried a quiet chill. You believe these diaries suggest something more deliberate than misfortune? He looked at her squarely. I do, and so does one member of the family. Though he won't speak of it openly, he's asked me to make discreet inquiries in times past. The local authorities accepted the notion of a family curse, and left it at that. But those diaries hint at something altogether darker, something that's been systematically covered up. She returned the diary scrap to its folder. I see, and you want me to discover what truly happened. Mr. Pendleton straightened his vest as though the gesture might shore up his resolve. Precisely. You've a reputation, Miss Marple, for noticing the things others overlook. Your discretion is frankly invaluable. The Wisterfields prefer to keep their dignity intact. You'll understand they fear S.E. Handel more than any talk of curse. She considered the furnishings, the hush of old wood, the faint rustle of unseen pages in the next room. It struck her that Mr. Pendleton's tidy aura contrasted sharply with the murkiness of what he was asking. Yet she also recognized that resolute set of his brow. He wasn't one for flights of fancy. If he believed these diaries indicated foul play, it likely meant something tangible lurked beneath the rumor. Mill, have you told the family of your intentions? She asked gently. He gave a small dry smile. So you know some suspect, but not all. Let's call it a private arrangement between Sir Pulgy and myself. Officially you're just going to stay as a guest, show some interest in the estate's history. Unofficially we hope you'll root out the truth. Miss Marple slipped off her gloves and placed them tidily in her handbag, a subtle ritual she performed when accepting a task with serious intent. It sounds a formidable challenge, Mr. Pendleton. Her tone was mild, but there was a steadfast light in her eyes. I'm quite intrigued. He exhaled relief, softening the lines in his face. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. It's not merely an academic exercise. A suspicious death from the 1920s might have ties to more recent tragedies, all glibly explained away by the Wisterfield Curse. If there's a and I do use that word carefully, I fear they've operated unimpeded for some time. She allowed a small silence to settle, digesting the gravity of his words. I'll do my utmost, she said at last, to examine all angles. Sometimes superstition is more convenient than the truth, and far less terrifying. In the end, a faint smile tugged at his lips. You have no idea how grateful we are. I shall arrange everything. You'll arrive at Wisterfield Hall on Friday, ostensibly to catalogue all letters at Sel's request. She found the notion quietly amusing. Miss Marple, a mild spinster from St. Mary, me suddenly pressed into detective service on a grand estate, yet she said nothing about her amusement, only returned his smile with a composed nod. They rose. The meeting nearly concluded. Mr. Pendleton escorted her to the door, hand resting lightly on her elbow as though guiding her from potential prying eyes along the corridor. Employees maintained their respectful hush, heads bent over typewriters and ledgers. Before she left, she hesitated, a final question simmering in her mind. If I may, what exactly do those diaries contain, beyond that snippet? He frowned. Most cryptic references to accidents that weren't accidents to money or property, concerns always followed by the writer's sense of dread. I'm no detective, but I can read between the lines, Miss Marple. This family has a skeleton or two rattling around its closets. Outside the day had warmed, bringing a faint haze to the town's rooftops. A distant church bell struck the hour. Miss Marple paused on the step, drawing in a measured breath. In her bag lay the solicitor's scribbled directions to Wisterfield, PA, along with a carefully typed letter of introduction. She knew the path ahead would be lined with half-truths and polite misdirection, especially in a society where preserving a grand family's reputation often overshadowed justice. But she also knew the best means of shining a light on old secrets was to wear the same benign smile that fooled so many. If someone was orchestrating these accidents, they might never suspect a quiet lady with a back for noticing small inconsistencies. Her thoughts were punctuated by a carriage rattling down the cobblestones, the driver calling out a half-hearted greeting. Miss Marple offered a courteous nod, then with that calm methodical grace so characteristic of her, she set her course back to the railway station. A place called Wisterfield Hall awaited its brambles of rumour entwined in diaries and curses, and quite possibly murder. The next step of her journey would be made in silence and observation, and there was no one better equipped for it. After all, curses were only as powerful as people's willingness to believe them, and if there was something more tangible like old-fashioned greed, or the cunning hand of a killer.
Well, that was a truth. Even a dusty diary could reveal to those who knew how to read.
Between the lines the road snaked through a grove of twisted elm trees, before opening onto a broad gravel drive.
Dust swirled in the evening light, as the taxi's wheels crunched to a halt. Miss Marple stepped down with careful grace, her eyes taking in the imposing silhouette of Wisterfield Hall. It loomed against the dusky sky like a grand dowager, whose youth and beauty had long since passed echoes of past grandeur, hidden beneath creeping ivy and chipped stone.
From her vantage at the bottom of the entrance steps, Miss Marple caught the scent of damp leaves and neglected roses. A breeze stirred the overgrown hedges, carrying a whisper of something long-buried scandal, or secrets best left alone. Adjusting her hat, she made her way up the warm marble stairs, bag in hand. The heavy double doors carved with ancestral crests swung inward on winding hinges. Inside, the foyer spread out like a dark cathedral. Chandeliers of crystal and brass gleamed faintly, though many bulbs had burned out or been left unlit. Dim lamplight underscored the lines of age. A threadbare carpet, streaks of tarnish on gilt frames, smudges at the edges of wallpaper. Once brilliant with color, there was opulence here, but it lay beneath layers of quiet neglect. Sir Percival Wisterfield, tall, a touch stocky, strode forward to greet her with rigid courtesy. His salt and pepper hair receded from his brow, casting deeper shadows upon anxious grey eyes. Miss Marple, is it delighted you've arrived safely?
His tone exuded forced warmth, as if he'd rehearsed the line. I trust the journey wasn't too tiresome. The detective offered a polite smile. Not at all, Sir Percival. A most scenic route, I should think. Her voice held a gentle calm that often put people at ease, though whether Sir Percival found comfort or merely a polite barrier, one could not say. Behind him stood an elderly woman with a rail-thin frame and a face carved by both time and worry. Lady Constance. Westerfield's sharp gaze flickered over Miss Marple, before slipping away as though glancing for ghosts in the flickering candle light. She wore a high-collared gown of dark velvet, a silver cane at her side. In the half-gloom, her eyes glinted with something akin to suspicion, or perhaps just memory.
"Welcome, Lady Constance," said voice seldom have visitors these days. She paused, her hand trembling on the cane's handle. And never at night. There was no mistaking her meaning. After dusk, Wisterfield Hall was hardly welcoming. Miss Marple, undeterred, simply dipped her head in a respectful nod. She glimpsed movement in the background. The staff, perhaps, trying not to stare, or maybe they were in grand houses such as this. News traveled faster than the speed of telegrams. A single new guest could set an entire household ivor with speculation. A purposeful click of heels announced the arrival of Mrs. Davenport, the housekeeper. She was a tall woman with hair swept into a strict bun, and a non-nonsense manner that bristled at the edges of civility. "I'll show you to your room," she announced firmly. "Unless Sir Percival wishes to speak with you further, Mom," she added, a belated courtesy, as if she only remembered protocol after it had slipped her mind. Sir Percival, still grappling with some inner worry, waved her on. "By all means, Mrs. Davenport. Let Miss Marple freshen up. Supper's at 8. We'll talk then, if you'd prefer." With a final glance, Lady Constance offered Miss Marple, the ghost of a polite smile, "Who mind the corridors? Some of them don't have much light. It's easy to
lose your way." The soft quaver in her voice suggested more than mere architectural inconvenience. Mrs. Davenport led Miss Marple along a corridor, lined with portraits of stiff-lipped ancestors, each in a formal stance, eyes seeming to follow passers-by dated brass sconces through elongated shadows, giving the impression that the entire lineage was leaning in hungry for gossip. Miss Marple's footsteps fell quietly in on the moth-eaten carpet, her calm demeanor unchanged, but her gaze sweeping from faded frames to the intricately molded crown work on the ceiling. "Picking your pardon, Mrs. Davenport," said,
note of professional distance in her voice, "but we don't often take new guests. The staff are on edge, especially with recent matters." She did not elaborate, but the brief catch in her throat told Miss Merrill all she needed to know. Talk of curses and misfortunes still lingered like a bad smell in these hall's walls. They passed a tall window glazed with dust. Beyond the glass, the twilight reveals sprawling gardens gone wild, thorny rose bushes, choked stone statues, and an unkempt hedge maze loomed in silhouette. It felt like another world, one silent with expectation, awaiting some unspoken reckoning. Mrs. Davenport gestured to a door near the end of the corridor. Your room, Mom." Inside waited a modest yet comfortable chamber, a canopy bed, and a small writing desk piled with linen stationery, bearing the Wisterfield crest. The single lamp on the bedside table glowed faintly, its warm circle of light barely pushing back the gloom. "I trust you'll find everything satisfactory." The housekeeper's voice remained stiff, but her guarded eyes betrayed a cautious curiosity. "If you need anything, ring the bell. I'll come or send Mary."
"Thank you," Miss Merrill replied, setting her handbag on a nearby armchair. "Quite adequate indeed." She paused, letting her eyes drift around the details, the faint whiff of lavender sachet in the drawers, a tapestry depicting huntsmen and hounds chasing a stag, no doubt a relic of the family's more prosperous days. "Lovely old tapestry," she remarked lightly. "I imagine it's been in the house for centuries." Mrs. Davenport gave a perfunctory nod. "The family keeps many heirlooms." Her gaze darted to a locked door at the end of the corridor. As she turned to leave, "Some rooms are off limits, of course, too damaged to be of any use." And with that cryptic explanation, she disappeared down the hallway alone. Miss Merrill permitted herself a moment's
reflection. She removed her hat, smoothed her hair, and listened, truly listened to the house. The hush between the walls felt alive, crackling with the faint hush of secrets. Floorboards creaked in distant rooms. A muffled thump echoed, then faded. She half smiled. Curses and curses. Indeed, curiosity pricked at her mind, as if the old tapestry or the locked doors might whisper answers. But she maintained composure in a house like Wisterfield. Illusions were as thick as dust. Best to keep her eyes open, and her assumptions guarded. A soft rap sounded at the door. She opened it to see a young maid holding a jug of hot water. The maid's wide brown eyes flicked about nervously. "Will you please, men? Sir Pearl says dinner is in an hour. He wants you to feel welcomed." Her voice trembled as though she spoke lines in a play, and wasn't sure she got the part right. Miss Merrill, heartening the girl with a kindly nod, accepted. "The water, thank you, my dear." She waited until the maid withdrew, scaring off like a mouse in a cathedral. A creeping suspicion told her that everyone here felt like a player in some elaborate stage performance, each with secrets, each anxious that the next act might reveal more than they were prepared to show. She turned back to the tapestry. Light from the bedside lamp caught on a glint of thread, illuminating a hound's embroidered teeth. What she recalled Mr. Pendleton's words, "Our diaries," hinting at something beyond mere superstition. And so in the dim hush of Wisterfield Hall, Miss Marple readied herself for whatever shadowy steps lay ahead. This place was no mere relic of the past. It was a living testament to secrets lost in dark corners. Sooner or later one of those secrets would speak up, if only to defend itself. Outside, dusk settled into full night. The lingering glow through the tall window became no more than a faint glimmer on tangled gardens and creeping ivy within the manor's aging corridors. Echoes of half-forgotten regrets seemed to linger at the edge of every footstep. Miss Merrill took a moment to straighten her jacket, smoothing imaginary wrinkles. She would be heading downstairs soon, ready to meet the rest of the household at dinner, ready to observe, to listen, and to catch the subtle clues that had a habit of surfacing in quiet conversation. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, its deep knell resonating through the walls. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple sensed the quiet tension that shrouded Wisterfield like a worn velvet cloak. The stage was set, and though the players might cling to old illusions, the time for truth would come. With that, she flicked off the bedside lamp, letting the darkness settle in. There was no rush, the night was still young, and a labyrinth of secrets lay waiting to be discovered. If there was a killer lurking under the guise of a curse, Miss Merrill intended to meet them armed with nothing more and nothing less than her relentless curiosity and unassuming charm. A long gilded mirror loomed over the drawing-room fireplace, reflecting the subtle tensions in the room as though capturing ghosts. Electric lamps fizzed against velvet wallpaper, revealing corners of the stately space that time had draped in shadows. Beneath a high ceiling, what cobwebs lurked in the filigree. Members of the Wisterfield clan assembled at Sep's Purcell, summons each perched in cautious clusters. The air carried a cool hush as though the very walls listened. Miss Merrill stood near a polished sideboard, sampling a small glass of cordial with quiet interest, though she appeared the picture of gentile reserve, hands folded, posture upright. Her gaze swept the room like a watchman's lantern. She noticed a hint of rancor in the set of a distant cousin's jaw, the tremor in Lady Constance's fingers as she clutched her cane by the settee, the anxious glances two siblings exchanged from opposite ends of the room as if fearful of unseen ears. Everyone here had something to conceal, or so it seemed. Sir Pearl, shifting his stance with restless energy, cleared his throat to garner attention. "Thank you all for gathering. I realize it's somewhat unusual to call a family discussion at this hour." His eyes darted to a tall clock ticking away against the paneled walls. "But matters pressing on us can't be ignored forever." He attempted a confident smile, but it emerged shaky at the corners, as though poorly pinned. A hush stretched across the drawing room, interrupted only by the shuffle of feet on the Persian rug. Someone coughed, someone else fiddled with a teacup. Lady Constance, perched stiffly on a seat nearest the library doors, said nothing under the chandelier's glow. Her pale complexion verged on translucent, revealing the deep lines of worry etched around her mouth. Miss Marple watched the subtle interplay of apprehension and curiosity among the guests' distant cousins. Two men in well-tailored suits, a woman with a flamboyant claw hat, lingered together with forced smiles that never quite reached their eye. A brother and sister rumored to be quarreling over an inheritance hovered near the door. Small talk had sputtered out minutes ago. Mention of the so-called murder from decades past caused an abrupt shift of posture, as though each set of shoulders carried the weight of that old spectre. The hush that followed Sir Pearl's words reminded Miss Merrill of a child stepping onto thin ice, uncertain which footfall might crack the surface. She took another small sip of cordial, letting the tension churn in her mind's eye. She noted the swirling currents of suspicion, glances that flicked from one face to another, searching for a turn in the facade. Clearing his throat again, Sir Pearl ventured on. "It's no secret that our dear estate has deed certain superstitions over the centuries. We all know the stories of a curse that in every generation, a Wisterfield meets a tragic, often unexplained end. My father dismissed it as nonsense, but the rumors persist." He gave a worn smile, half apologetic. "And truth, these stories cast a long shadow on our family, and recently with new details emerging about the 1920s tragedy, I thought it best we address matters plainly. Miss Merrill here," he gestured, voice wobbling just a little, "has joined us to help set things to rest." At her cue, Miss Merrill bowed her head slightly, eyes still mild as a Sunday school teacher's. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gathering. One cousin, tall and severe, pressed parted lips together as though suppressing a question. Another relative, an elegant woman wearing too many pearls, shot a furtive glance at Lady Constant, who remained silent but watchful. Lady Constant at length set her cane aside, and spoke in a voice, low yet resonant. "You must forgive our weariness, Miss Marple. The stories you hear, the speculation, some prefer them remain. Just that, speculation." Her face twitched in a ghost of a smile. "Our family has had enough. Tragedy without sensational rumors. But if you seek clarity, well, perhaps it's time." A hush fell again, thick as the musty drapes that line the walls. The distant cousins shifted, rearranging themselves in an uncertain dance of decorum. Miss Merrill sensed the moment had turned confessional. The entire room poised on the edge of old pain, secret shame and abiding mistrust. Breaking the tension, a slender man, with a quick wit introduced earlier as cousin, Lonol let out a soft chuckle that rang false. "Come now, a family curse." He glanced around with feigned confidence. "Surely we're above such superstition in this enlightened age." No one laughed in reply. Instead, another cousin, half hidden behind the high-back sofa, spoke in a near whisper. "Yet tragedy does follow us, does it not? Uncle Edward, Harriet." The list grows. She left the names hanging like a damp cloth on a line, an air of finality in each syllable. Sir Peral fidgeted with the lapel of his jacket, "which is precisely why we must address it now. If there is in fact a pattern," he paused, swallowing something akin to dread, "then we owe it to ourselves to see if that pattern has, shall we say, a more earthly explanation." His words met with stiff nods from some, weary suspicion from others. Miss Marple, on her part, made no grand pronouncements. She merely observed the shifting allegiances and coded glances behind each polite mask. She glimpsed fear or anger or resentment. Everyone seemed to suspect they knew the culprit behind these dark events, if indeed such a culprit existed, but no one dared speak it aloud. A sudden stirring near the adjoining library drew attention. The door stood ajar, revealing tall bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes. Flickers of lamplight danced across the parquet floor within. One of the cousins coughed nervously, as if recalling that the library held a more direct association with tragedy. Whispers of a body found in that very room, locked from the inside. A hush settled once again. Seal exhaled, stepping toward the threshold that connected drawing room to library. "I shall do my utmost to quell these rumors," he declared. "But if the diaries and old letters prove anything, well, the truth may be more disturbing than a mere curse." From her vantage, Miss Marple watched the guests. She saw how cousin Lionel's forced bravado seemed to falter. The severe cousin's mouth pressed into a tight line. Lady Constant's frail figure appeared to wilt further against the CTI, her eyes gliding from face to face, as if searching for something, perhaps betrayal or confirmation. A mild exchange of niceties followed, talk of supper or a nightcap, but no one seemed especially hungry. Each relative had their own reason to steer the conversation away from the family's skeletons. Miss Marple's voice, when it finally came, was soft as a leaf falling in autumn. "Appreciate your candidness, Sir Peral," she said. "Sometimes merely shedding light on what lurks in the dark is enough to loosen its hold." Her comment drew a faint smirk from Lady Constant. "If only the old matriarch," murmured the Wisterfields, "have lived under shadows for generations. It remains to be seen." What more light might reveal a faint ring from the hallway? Sign signaled the dinner bell, yet no one rushed to respond. Instead, they lingered uneasy in that plush drawing room. The chandelier overhead rattled a little, as though responding to the unspoken tension. Then one by one the relatives drifted into the corridor, leaving Miss Marlens Peral trailing behind. She took a final glance around the drawing room, the tall mirror, reflecting the receding figures, the aura of half-truths clinging to every plush seat, an ornate painting. The hush felt like a held breath waiting for a secret to be spoken. When they were alone, Sir Peral lowered his voice. "I'm grateful for your calm, Miss Marple. Truly, my family, they are not accustomed to direct questions." Miss Merrill offered a gentle smile. "In my experience, Sir Peral, everyone has answers. They just don't always know the questions yet." They left the drawing room, stepping through the threshold as a draft fluttered the curtains, and in that moment, as the chandelier glow yielded to the corridor's shadows, Miss Merrill suspected that Wisterfield Hall's secrets were deeper than mere superstition. Fear, jealousy and greed thrived behind its closed doors. The puzzle lay in fitting each piece of the Wisterfield puzzle into place before another tragedy, curse or not paid. The family an irrevocable visit. Twilight wrapped the drawing room in wavering shadows, softened only by the glow of a pair of tall lamps. Their light glanced off polished wood paneling, reflecting faintly in the mirrors that lined the walls like silent spectators. Miss Marple stood near the velvet drapes, letting her eyes rove over the assembled Wisterfields. Voices mingled, tense, subdued, and laced with a practical politeness that suggested more than courtesy was at stake. Sir Perel Wisterfield was seated at the head of a long gleaming table. Unlike the usual grand feasts hosted in this hall,
this was a smaller, more intimate affair,
if it could be called that. He tapped his fingertips on the tabletop, as if he hoped his own impatience might set the tone. Several relatives ringed him, distant cousins, a sibling or two. Lady Constant, just behind his right shoulder. Murmurs rolled across the room, but no one ventured a direct question. Thank you all for coming. Sewell began. His voice quivered with an eagerness to quell unrest, to contain gossip, but he tried to sound commanding, no least informal. Gatherings aren't typical, but given the circumstances I felt it necessary. A thin cousin in a threadbare suit cleared his throat. Circumstances indeed, folks are. Whispering again, and frankly it's getting out of hand. His eyes darted across faces as though gauging who believed what. A cousin with a formidable jaw and an air of offended pride spoke next, voice brimming with condemnation. What I want to know, he said sharply, is why an outsider has been brought in. No offense. A stiff nod toward
Miss Marple, but I can't see how exposing our private matters to a stranger is going to do any good. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, the kind that revealed nothing except her impeccable manners. I assure you, dear sir, I've no intention of intruding on anything unnecessarily private, but some matters benefit from fresh eyes. He snorted, arms folded. That's all well and good, but we've had enough. Rumors in this house, enough prying eyes for a lifetime. Before Sir Peril could chastise him, another voice piped in, a nervous, breathy cousin, her posture half hidden behind a high-backed chair. I've heard noises, she said, her cheeks reddening at the attention at night, in the corridor's footsteps, when no one's there. If you ask me, this place is haunted, and if there is a curse, she shuddered. I wouldn't doubt it. A ripple of hushed discomfort passed through the gathering. Lady Constant raised a slender hand to quiet the stir. Superstitious nonsense, she murmured, though her tone wavered on the last word. She glanced at Miss Merrill, the faintest hint of apology in her eyes. Sir Peril seized the moment precisely. Why, we must dispel these rumors once and for all. The Wisterfield name has suffered enough from idle talk and old tragedies. If we can prove the curse is but a myth. He paused, glancing almost helplessly at Miss Marple. That's where our good friend here can assist. Miss Merrill caught how quickly he'd pivoted from politely cordial to putting her on the spot. She returned his look with calm assurance. I intend only to understand how so many accidents, she let the word hang delicately, could befall a single household. Perhaps it's chance, perhaps something else. The important thing is to look at the facts. The defensive cousin tried another objection, but Sir Peril waved him down. The hush that followed was almost suffocating, a moment suspended between fear and resentment. At length Sir Percival dismissed them with practical graciousness. Thank you all for humoring my request. I won't take more of your time tonight. Little knots of family members drifted toward the door, subdued as funeral goers. Lady Constant, however, remained by the tall windows staring out at the mist-clad gardens. She beckoned Miss Marple closer with a subtle tilt of her head. When the others had vanished into the corridors, she turned, pressing a thin hand to the cameo at her throat. I'm sorry about all that unpleasantness. We're not unaccustomed to conflict here, but it's wearing all the same. Miss Marple noted the tremor in the older woman's voice. Tensions run when tragedy lingers unchecked, she said gently. I suspect most families would react similarly. Lady Constance's gaze roved around the drawing room, resting momentarily on the doors to the adjacent library.
Mows of dust drifted in the lamplight, as though time itself had slowed. I've never truly believed in curses, but how else do we explain all those untimely deaths? Her voice came out in a whisper, full of old heartbreak, and a flicker of shame at acknowledging something so superstitious for a moment. The older woman looked frailer than ever, decades of sorrow etched into her features, and Miss Merrill could see that stoic composure cracking just a little at the edges. I tried telling myself it's coincidence, or God's will if you like. Then I look around and see the hush that falls whenever someone mentions the library, or the black armband are made discreetly, war after the last tragedy, and I realize how fear has rooted itself in these very walls. Gentle but resolute, Miss Merrill laid a hand on Lady Constance's wrist. From what I've seen, fear can flourish on illusions, if there is something more grounded at work here, something that's been conveniently labeled curse light might be the best remedy. Lady Constance let out a slow sigh, her cane tapping softly on the marbled floor. Perhaps I only hope the truth is less frightening than the rumors. Miss Merrill smile held no judgment, merely understanding. That's all. Truth tends to be frightening at first, but undeniably simpler than living under a cloud of speculation. The next chime of a distant clock reminded them of the voices rose faintly in the corridor, family members whispering behind closed doors, scuttling off to separate corners. Miss Merrill excused herself, leaving Lady Constance near the window, gazing at her own ghostly reflection in the glass. Outside the world was cloaked in twilight. The hush inside the hall carried a stillness suggesting that any word or misstep could await old grudges. Yet in that hush, Miss Marple felt a sepulchre. Doubt had been sown, and with doubt came the possibility of reason. Emerging from beneath the veil of superstition, she moved quietly toward the corridor, resonance of her footsteps swallowed by thick carpets. With each stride she held on to the notion that curses seldom stood up to scrutiny. Sooner or later the shadowy corners of Wisterfield Hall would yield a secret or two, and if not to her gentle queries, then perhaps to the weight of its own hidden guilt. In a wing of Wisterfield Hall, seldom trodden by living feet, the air was thick with dust, and the ghosts of neglect. Miss Marple, her eyes alight with quiet determination, followed an estate artist down a narrow creaking staircase into the attic. Here the splendor of bygone days was eclipsed by cobweb trunks, battered crates, and a pervasive must of old paper. The space, small and claustrophobic, seemed to harbor more secrets than the stately drawing room had ever revealed. Mind your step, Miss Merrill, the artist, an unassuming gentleman named Mr. Blackwood, warned in a hushed tone as he carefully lifted the lid of a large cracked wooden chest. These relics aren't just memories. They're prone to upset. His voice carried a measured timbre that belied the urgency of the moment. Miss Merrill smiled in gentle acknowledgement. I dare say, Mr. Blackwood, even memories can be dangerous when left unchecked. Her dry wit, though subtle, lent an air of both humor and resolve to her measured steps. Together, combed through piles of faded letters, yellowed photographs and battered diaries that whispered of a once vibrant family legacy, now marred by sorrow and secrecy, they paused before a particularly worn trunk, its surface etched with the delicate patterns of a long-forgotten era. As Mr. Blackwood propped it open, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a small leather-bound volume, with pages scorched at the edges, a diary half-burned and brittle with age. Its cover bore an embossed crest and initials that hinted at a Victorian matriarch, her name lost to time but her words indelibly inked upon the fragile pages. Now this is intriguing, she murmured delicately, lifting the diary from the trunk, as if it were a sacred relic. The faded ink on the page declared in an almost ghostly hand, dark deeds done in the family's name. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the clue resonating with the undercurrent of tragedy and hidden malice that had plagued Wisterfields for generations. Just then footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor outside the attic. Sir Pearl appeared at the doorway, for a brief moment, his face a mixture of apprehension and relief. Miss Merrill, he said softly, I'm grateful you're delving into these archives. There are matters here I'd rather not see brought to light, But perhaps truth is a force too potent to suppress. Before she could reply, Mr. Pendleton, the family solicitor, stepped in behind him, his tone low and measured. Indeed, he added, it seems that even the ashes of history have something to tell. I trust you'll find this diary as illuminating as it is unsettling. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression inscrutable. History, like a good mystery, leaves behind breadcrumbs. She observed sometimes even the charred remnants of a diary can speak volumes, if one listens carefully. Her voice carried the calm authority of a woman, accustomed to deciphering human nature, and behind her mild smile lay the sharpness of a mind that missed nothing. Returning her focus to the fragile pages, she carefully turned them, the script of the Victorian matriarch narrating, not just the weight of personal regrets but hints of conspiracy, a string of events and tragedies that might not have been as coincidental as the family's lamentable lore would suggest. The diary's cryptic passages spoke of clandestine meetings, financial woozes that bordered on extortion, and whispered warnings of retribution that smacked more of calculated malice than of supernatural fate. Quite the portfolio of misfortune, Miss Marple remarked dry, glancing at Mr. Blackwood. It appears that our dear matriarch was as adept at concealing truths as any modern spin doctor. Mr. Blackwood, shifting uncomfortably among the dusty boxes, offered a tentative smile. I've always believed that the past holds its secrets close, Miss Marple. It takes a keen eye to see the patterns beneath the sorrow and the charred ink. As they continued their examination, the attic's oppressive atmosphere thick with a tangible weight of long ago, despair seemed to press in on them. Yet within that stifling gloom, the diary's revelations began to stitch together a tapestry of motives, greed lurking behind lavish inheritances, jealousy simmering beneath a polished veneer of aristocracy, and fear that had for generations been masked by talk of curses and superstitions. Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, each line of the diary a subtle clue, a red herring to be weighed against the cold logic of human nature. It appears, she whispered almost to herself, as she carefully set the diary aside in a protective case, that the true curse here may be nothing more than the sins of men, hidden behind ghost stories and well-practiced deference. Her observation, delivered with a calm precision of a seasoned detective, resonated in the silence of the attic. Outside, the wind began to murmur through the eaves, as if echoing the long-forgotten secrets that now stirred awake under Miss Marple's attentive gaze. And in that charged moment, it was clear the dusty relics of the past were not inert artifacts but living clues, each one beckoning toward a truth obscured by both time and the artful silence of those determined to hide their misdeeds. In the lesser-used wing of Wisterfield Hall, where the glow of recent grandeur had long since been swallowed by dust and decay, Miss Marple ascended a narrow creaking staircase into the attic. The space was a cramped archive of forgotten memories. Cobwebbed trunks, battered crates, and the musty tang of old paper mingled with the faint odor of mothballs here. Amid the relics of the past, even the silence seemed to murmur secrets. An estate archist, a taciturn man named Mr. Blackwood, assisted her as he hefted a heavy storage box to one side. I've kept these boxes undisturbed for you years, he said quietly, his tone a blend of respect and unease. The family isn't keen on stirring up what might be best left buried. His words, like the scattered dust, motes in the stale air, hinted at mysteries too weighty to ignore. Miss Marple's eyes, ever observant beneath the brim of her modest hat, swept over the chaotic assemblage of letters, photographs, and diaries. Her gloved fingers brushed against a small leather-bound volume, with its cover embossed by a faded crest. The diary, though its pages were brittle and corners singed, bore a chill message in its very title, if one could call it that, a testament of dark deeds committed in the family's name. With methodical care, she opened the diary. The hand of a Victorian matriarch, firm yet tremulous with despair, had scrolled across the yellowed pages cryptic entries of misfortune. As Miss Marple turned the fragile leaves, her practiced eye caught sight of a folded envelope tucked between them. Its edges were blackened by flame, and it seemed almost to pulse with a silent urgency, breaking the delicate seal. Miss Marple extracted a letter in neat somber script. It read, "Beware, the bloodline tainted by one whose very nature feasts upon violence, the illegitimate wield. Our black sheep carries within him an appetite for murder which can never be sated." A pause fell over the attic. The phrase appetite for murder resonated in stillness, its implications far removed from superstitious mumblings. It was a warning, not from the beyond, but from a hand steeped in familiar bitterness, and the dark calculus of revenge. At that moment the door creaked, and as Penrose appeared briefly in the doorway, his expression a complex mask of caution and reluctance. "Miss Marple," he murmured, voice low, "I hoped you'd find something before any further word could pass." Mr. Pendleton entered his polished manor momentarily at odds with the grim relics around them. "I trust the archives are proving useful," he said, his tone measured and cool. "Gentlemen accustomed to dancing around inconvenient truths." Miss Marple closed the diary with deliberate care. "This letter," she said, holding it up for both men to see, "points to an illegitimate branch of our dear family, a relative whose violent proclivities might explain more than mere misfortune." Her eyes sharp and unyielding flicked to Mr. Pendleton. "It suggests that what has been cloaked as a curse might in fact be a convenient ruse to cover up actual crimes." Mr. Pendleton's lips tightened. "Do you mean to say that our so-called curse is but a smokescreen?" he asked, his voice betraying a note of apprehension. "Precisely," Miss Marple replied in her characteristically unflappable tone, a dry smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "When tragedy becomes a family trademark, one must wonder if fate has been suborned by a more deliberate hand. Greed, jealousy, and fear, it seems, can be as lethal as any supernatural force." Mr. Blackwood shuffled closer, his face flickering over the diary and the letter as if in silent confirmation. "It appears," he said softly, "that this relic may tie together the many unexplained deaths, not accidents but acts calculated, perhaps for the sake of inheritance or revenge. In that cramped, dust-laden space the evidence coalesced into a narrative far more prosaic than the fanciful legends of curses. It was a conspiracy, woven from human ambition, a cover-up by those who preferred scandal to the ignominy of admitting their own culpability." Miss Mar's realization was as clear as the faded ink on the fragile pages. "The curse then is not an act of divine retribution, but the handiwork of men," she murmured almost to herself, "a guise under which the true appetite for murder was masked generation after generation." Outside the attics, oppressive silence seemed to affirm her deduction in that moment, as the weight of evidence settled among the dusty boxes and old ledgers. Miss Marple had always known that the real horrors of the world were not supernatural. No ghostly hand reaching from beyond the grave, no ancient curse whispering doom in the dead of night. The true terror lay in human nature itself, in greed, in ambition, in the cold, calculated acts of those who held power over Wisterfield Hall for generations. And now, with a single cryptic letter, a forgotten diary, and the hushed whispers of the past, the puzzle was beginning to take shape. The attic, once a mere repository of dust-covered relics and discarded heirlooms, had transformed into a vault of undeniable truth. The so-called Wisterfield Curse had never been supernatural at all, it was human. The final pieces had led her to the one place where true secrets were always harbored, not within the grand ballroom, not in the echoing corridors of the great hall, but in the kitchen, where servants murmured in low voices, where lives were quietly observed from the shadows. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Wisterfield Hall's grand kitchen, its golden rays softened by a century of dust and whispered tragedies. The massive oak counter gleamed beneath the glow of well-used copper pots and aged porcelain. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and burnt sugar, a deceptive aroma of warmth, masking the chill of unease. Miss Marple stepped inside. She was the picture of understated inquiry, a modest hat tilted just so, a neat grey dress pressed with quiet precision, her blue eyes carrying the deceptive softness of a kindly old spinster. But beneath that gentle exterior, her mind was razor-sharp, slicing through decades of deceit. At the counter stood Mrs. Davenport, the housekeeper, a woman of stiff posture and calloused hands that had served generations of Wisterfields. The rhythmic clatter of china and the low hum of a well-practiced routine gave the space an illusion of domestic peace. Miss Marple smiled, warm as the steam rising from the freshly poured tea. "Afternoon, Mrs. Davenport," she greeted, her voice light but laced with gentle persistence. The housekeeper paused, steadying a porcelain teapot as though bracing herself for what was to come. "Miss Marple," she acknowledged with a nod, her voice measured, carefully neutral. "I wonder if you might spare a few moments," Miss Marple continued, watching the woman's face as she spoke, "to chat about the unfortunate events that have befallen these walls." For a fraction of a second, the housekeeper's fingers tightened around the teapot handle. A flicker of something, hesitation, fear, regret, crossed her eyes before she smothered it beneath a mask of stoic professionalism. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, though her voice carried the weight of an unspoken burden. "It's been a hard road for us, what with all the tragedies." "You mean the old murder?" Mrs. Davenport's head snapped up slightly, her gaze flickering toward the heavy wooden door at the far end of the kitchen. Beyond it lay the library, the very room that had been sealed shut from within all those years ago. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than before, she murmured, "Yes, that." Miss Marple lifted her cup with measured grace, her movements unhurried, her expression thoughtful. "I recall the incident. 1920s, was it? A locked room, no sign of forced entry, a man found dead inside, and yet, no one ever quite pieced together the manner of his unfortunate demise." The housekeeper exhaled, slow and steady. "There's a hush that still clings to the memory of that night, isn't there?" Mrs. Davenport's gaze drifted back to the library door, her lips pursed, as though weighing whether to speak. "Folks say the library was locked from within, as though the victim had met a fate too macabre for plain explanation," she said at last. "Some say it was the curse, others whisper of a quarrel, one that ended in blood." Her voice dropped lower, almost as if afraid the very walls might overhear. "But here in Wisterfield Hall, we know how fear can thicken the air." Before Miss Marple could respond, a noise stirred from the doorway behind her. A timid voice, small, trembling, rose from the narrow corridor leading to the servants' quarters. Miss Marple turned. There, half hidden behind the slightly ajar door, stood a young maid, barely past her teens, wringing her hands, her face pale with uncertainty. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, as if afraid someone might overhear. Miss Marple's voice softened, inviting. "Yes, dear, you have something to say." The maid hesitated, then, voice barely above a whisper, she admitted, "I overheard something last week." Silence, even Mrs. Davenport stilled. The maid swallowed, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. There was an argument, two of the family members, fighting about the old inheritance. She cast a glance toward the kitchen door, as if checking for unseen listeners. It was fierce, miss, like one had every right to call the other a thief. They weren't talking about ghosts or curses. She took a shuddering breath. They were saying that money was worth more than a name. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside, the pieces were snapping into place. The curse had always been a convenient mask, a legend to hide the rot within, and now, greed had once again reached its hand through time. She stepped toward the maid, and gently patted her shoulder. "Thank you, dear, you've been very helpful." But her mind had already moved on. Later, in the shadowed corridor, where the kitchen led to the servants' quarters, Miss Marple paused. A tall, stately figure stood in the dim light, the butler. His presence was one of silent authority, his eyes watchful, calculating. Miss Marple studied him a moment before speaking. "The staff's stories, sir, speak of more than superstition. There's talk of disputes, old wounds never quite healed." The butler's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes flickered, just for a moment. Then, in a voice measured and deliberate, he murmured, "Madam, we do what we must in a household, where pride and profit are entwined." A pause. "It is best not to disturb what has long been settled," in hushed tones. Miss Marple held his gaze, and then, ever so slightly, she smiled, because she had already disturbed it. The truth she knew had already begun to rise, and soon Wisterfield Hall's secrets, the real ones, the ones hidden behind years of whispered lies, would finally come to light. Contributed his own fragment of recollection, while pruning a particularly stubborn rose bush. "I heard them too," he murmured one night, voices raised as if the very night was alive with anger. The scent of wet earth couldn't mask the bitterness in their words. They argued over fortunes and feuds of legacy, is stained by sorrow. His voice was low, yet each word carried the weight of a lifetime amid whispers of discontent. By the time Miss Marple had returned to the drawing room to review her notes, the methodical collection of confidences and murmurs had painted a picture far removed from the simple ghost stories that had long clung to Wisterfield Hall. Each account, from the whispered admissions of a frightened maid to the measured evasive responses of the butler, hinted at human motives of greed, jealousy, and fear, motivations that could well explain the unsolved murder of the 1920s, without recourse to supernatural forces. As the late afternoon shadows deepened into the hues of evening, Miss Marple reflected on the subtle clues the day had yielded in the gentle clink of china, the soft rustle of overgrown corridors, and the quiet yet fervent voices of those who served the household. Lay the truth obscured, not by curses, but by the very human imperfections of ambition and resentment. Quietly she resolved that the next step in her investigation would be to link these seemingly desperate pieces: a locked library, a disputed inheritance, whispered arguments, and reveal the ordinary, yet all too demonstrous machinations behind the so-called curse of Wisterfield Hall. Late in the afternoon, when the low sun turned the stone walls of Wisterfield Hall a soft sere hue, Miss Marple began her methodical round of inquiries. Her gentle persistence had already coaxed small confessions from the manor staff. Mrs. Davenport's quietly shared memories of locked libraries and hushed quarrels in the corridors. The timid maid's whispered revelations about bitter disputes over old inheritances. Now, with her notepad tucked neatly into her modest handbag, she set her sights on the village, where whispers and word clippings might tie together the family long-held secrets. In the nearby village, a modest building housed the local historical society, a cramped office lined with yellowed newspapers and brittle pamphlets. There Miss Marple met Mr. Hargreaves, an elderly historian, with a shock of silver hair and a pair of spectacles that magnified his earnest eyes. He greeted her with a courteous nod as she settled into a threadbare armchair, the scent of old paper and ink filling the room. "Miss Marple, I understand you're looking into the Wisterfield affair in Mr. Harry," said, tapping a stack of newspaper clippings on his desk. "These clippings have been gathered over decades. Most attribute the untimely death of the heir in that locked library to nothing more than a dreadful curse." He slid a brittle paper toward her, its headline bold and accusatory: "Here's tragic demise, blamed on supernatural curse." Miss Marple examined the clipping with quiet deliberation. "Us or not," she murmured, her tone soft yet piercing. "It appears that the family fortune benefited from each of these misfortunes." Her eyes flicked up to Mr. Hargreaves, and he nodded as though confirming a long-held suspicion. He continued, voice low, "You see, dear lady, the local papers would often sensationalize such tragedies, but beneath the theatrics, there were hints, financial windfalls, unexpected changes in wills, that suggest these weren't mere accidents or acts of fate." Fingers brushed over another clipping, detailing a similarly mysterious death in an earlier century, the margins filled with scribbled notes like inheritance settlement and beneficiary, leaving the Historical Society with a small bundle of clippings and a mind brimming with implications. Miss Marple returned to the manor to piece together her puzzle. The data she had collected from the staff, quiet murmurs of locked rooms, and whispered family feuds, and the vivid if sensational accounts from the village, painted a broader picture. The recurrent narrative of a curse was too conveniently timed with deaths that enriched certain branches of the Wisterfield lineage. In the hushed corridors of Wisterfield Hall, she retreated to a secluded alcove off the main staircase and pored over her findings, the brittle pages of newspaper articles, the soft recollections of frightened servants, and the measured words of a local historian began to interlace in her mind. One clipping's headline proclaimed inherited tragedy, fortune, and misfortune at Wisterfield. Another contained a quote from a long-departed editor: "When death visits the family, it leaves behind a trail of wealth as well as sorrow." A subtle smile tugged at Miss Marple's lips. It seems, she observed quietly to herself, that while superstition may have provided a convenient cloak, the real hand, guiding these tragedies, is all too human greed, jealousy, and fear sculpted into every whispered rumor. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen, where Mrs. Davenport, the butler, and the gardener had gathered for an early tea. They spoke in low tones of the past, of arguments over sums of money, and of unexplained tensions that had grown into family legends. A servant confided, "I always thought the curse was a tale told to keep us in line, but it's the rich who seem to prosper from every untimely death." Miss Merrill listened with the attentive empathy of someone who understood that every word, every glance was a piece of a larger puzzle. The whispered recollections, the angry undertones in discussions of money and legacy, all pointed to a systematic pattern. The misfortunes that befell the Wisterfields were not the caprice of fate, but rather a cold calculation. By the time twilight draped its quiet shadows over the estate, Miss Marple had built a tentative framework for her investigation. The newspaper clippings and the staff's cautious confessions began to coalesce into a theory was nothing more than a cunning facade, meticulously maintained to mask crimes of opportunity. Certain members of the family had reaped financial rewards from these tragedies, their hands stained with both money and moral decay. With dry wit and unwavering resolve she mused, "It appears that the true curse is not an otherworldly spectre, but the all too familiar vices of greed and jealousy, and in the murmurings of a village, and the quiet confessions of servants, we find the truth that no amount of superstition can hide." Thus, in the quiet, methodical manner that had become her trademark, Miss Merrill set the stage for the unraveling of a loathed-held conspiracy, a puzzle that piece by piece would reveal that the sinister history of Will was crafted not by a supernatural force, but by a very human desire for power and wealth. In a modest study, tucked away in a neglected wing of Wisterfield Hall, time itself seemed to slouch in the dusty air. Faded genealogical charts, brittle legend, and family trees, some meticulously drawn, others hastily scrolled, clung to the walls like cobwebs of memory. The single green banker's lamp cast a warm glow over the records, rendering the room both opulent and oppressively claustrophobic, as though every secret had found a place to hide in these confined quarters. Miss Marple stood before a large oak desk, her gloved hands resting lightly on a spread of parchments. Lady Constant, dignified despite years that had etched sorrow into her features, entered with a measured step. "Miss Marple," she began softly, "I have long guarded these records. The family's history is, as you might say, a labyrinth of half-truths and omissions. With deliberate care, she unrolled a series of genealogical charts. Here, she whispered, are the records that have been kept from prying eyes, names, dates, and notably several blanks and question marks where truth should reside." Miss Marple's keen eyes swept over the charts. "It appears," she murmured, "that certain names are missing entirely, as if excised from the family's narrative." Her tone was gentle, but beneath it lay the calm assurance of one accustomed to reading between the lines. "And pray, Lady Constant, might you explain this curious omission?" Lady Constant hesitated, her gaze drifting to a portrait of a stern matriarch in a gilded frame. "There is talk, quiet of course, of an illegitimate branch, a line that was never fully acknowledged. It was deemed best to omit those records to protect the family name from scandal." Her voice faltered, only slightly. "I have always suspected that the branch in question, though shrouded in silence, might bear more than just the stain of impropriety." At that moment the study door creaked open, and a distant cousin, Mr. Fenwick, a man whose gaunt features and furtive eyes betrayed a lifetime of unspoken resentments, stepped inside. "I trust you're discussing old family records," he said dryly, his tone a mix of irritation and guarded pride. Careful, Miss Merrill, some branches of our family are best left undisturbed. Miss Marple offered him a mild smile that did not quite reach her observant eyes. On the contrary, Mr. Fenwick, she replied, evenly, I find that even the silent BRs often speak the loudest truths. The very absence of a name can be as revealing as its presence. Her words, though softly spoken, carried the weight of a calculated inquiry. Mr. Fenwick's gaze flickered briefly over the charts before he folded his arms.
But you are inclined to stir up old ghosts,
He muttered. The records in question trace back to an illegitimate child, whose descendants have over time exhibited a most unusual penchant for misfortune. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. There's a rumor, you see, that someone from that line has an appetite for murder, a taste for blood, that has regrettably benefited certain heirs in more ways than one. A moment of charged silence passed as Miss Marple regarded him. It is curious, she said slowly, that each untimely death in our family seems to coincide with an expectable infusion of wealth, as though misfortune were being redirected. Her dry wit was not lost in the dim light of the study superstitions make for excellent cover stories, but I suspect a more human hand is at work, one driven by greed, jealousy, and a fear of exposure. Lady Constant, who had been watching silently, finally spoke in a trembling tone. I have always believed that fate was too capricious to account for the patent tragedies that have beset our name. Yet when I gaze upon these omissions, I cannot help but wonder if there was a deliberate effort to hide a murderous streak, a taste for murder perhaps as unseemly as it is inevitable in human nature. Mr. Fenwick bristled, his eyes narrowing. You imply then that the so-called curse is nothing more than a well-crafted ruse, a means to obscure the sins of those who would benefit from a death. Precisely, Miss Marple interjected softly. When fortune favors those who profit from calamity, one must ask if a supernatural curse is needed at all. She paused, her gaze drifting over the faded ink and blank spaces. These records suggest a pattern, one where the misfortunes conveniently align with shifts in inheritance. It is as though a particular branch of this family, the one born of shame and omission, has long harbored a propensity for, shall we say, eliminating obstacles to wealth. The study seemed to lean in closer, the quiet hum of the ancient clock punctuating the tension in that room filled with the ghosts of half-remembered histories and hidden branches. The true nature of the Wisterfield legacy was revealed. It was not a curse born of the supernatural, but a deliberate if unspoken conspiracy, a lineage marred by a singular appetite for power and blood. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy as she gathered the charts. It appears that true murderers may be found not in legends, but in the living, in the unacknowledged branches of our family tree. A most human curse indeed. And as the fading light gave way to the encroaching night, the study itself seemed to sigh under the burden of its secrets, a quiet testament to the fact that sometimes the darkest truths are hidden in plain sight, among the forgotten names of a family history, deliberately rewritten in a cramped study of a seldom trod corridor of Wisterfield Hall. Time itself seemed suspended amid the yellow genealogical charts and spidery family trees pinned haphazardly to the walls. The space with its heavy drapes and a single green banker's lamp exuded both faded opulence and an oppressive claustrophobe, a fitting setting for secrets long kept and names deliberately erased. Miss Marple stood before a broad oak desk, her gloved fingers lightly brushing over brittle records. She had come here to seek clarity in the tangle of half-truths that defined the Wisterfield legacy. The charts, some meticulously drawn, others hastily annotated with question marks and blank spaces, hinted at an omission that had troubled the family for generations. Lady Constant had earlier alluded to a branch of the family, one born of an illegitimate union, that had been quietly expunged from the official records before Miss Marple could study the charts. The door creaked open instead. A man whose presence seemed to rip the delicate atmosphere, under a distant cousin scarcely recognized in polite circles, yet unmistakably bearing the family name. His eyes, dark and nervous beneath a furrowed brow, darted about the study, as if expecting hidden eyes to be watching his voice when he spoke. was clipped with barely concealed hostility. "Forgive my interruption," he said, his tone laced with an edge of resentment, "but I must protest this meddling in affairs best left undisturbed." His gaze flicked to the documents, spread before Miss Marple. "Some truths once brought into the light cannot be unlearned." Miss Marple regarded him with a calm that belied the tension crackling in the air. "On the contrary, Mr. Dunnon, if I call you so," she said softly, "knowledge is the first step toward justice. The records reveal omissions. Mr. Dunstan's names are missing where they ought to be. Might you explain that?" The distant cousin's nostrils flared imperceptibly. "There are things in a family's past that are better left forgotten," he snapped. Though his voice faltered, he hesitated before adding in a lower tone, almost to himself, "and some fortunes, what might have been mine, are lost if the past is stirred up." That offhand remark, delivered with a bitter sneer, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. The insinuation hung in the air like a wisp of smoke. "What might have been yours?" she inquired, her tone polite yet pointed. "I trust you are referring to matters of inheritance." He flushed, the color rising in his "Inheritance, fortune, words that carry weight in our family," he said bitterly. "I suppose you've heard that our branch, the one from that illegitimate line, has never been fully acknowledged. Some say we were disowned, not just for scandal but for a taste for murder." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and his eyes darted about as if to ward off unseen reproach. If you look closely, you'll see that every untimely death in the Wisterfields has conveniently benefited someone from our very blood, unrecognized by polite society." Miss Mar's lips curved in a thin smile, a subtle blend of dry wit and quiet determination. "It is an intriguing theory," she remarked, "that a so-called curse might be nothing more than a convenient cover for calculated fortune, a scheme engineered by those with something to gain from tragedy." Her eyes lingered on him, noting every twitch of his jaw and the way his fingers drummed nervously against his coat. "Yet I suspect there is more here than mere rumor. Our records suggest a deliberate excision of a branch that may hold the key to these patterned misfortunes." The tension in the room deepened as Mr. Dunstan's expression shifted from indignation to guarded apprehension. He looked away, then back at the genealogical charts, as if hoping they might offer him a defense. "You think," he began haltingly, "that our family's curse is not supernatural at all, but the handiwork of men driven by envy, greed, and a need to secure what is rightfully theirs?" Miss Marple inclined her head slowly. "I do," she said, her voice measured and calm. "When every tragedy is shadowed by an inexplicable finite benefit, one must ask, in our family seems to coincide with an explicable infusion of wealth, as though misfortune were being redirected." Her dry wit was not lost in the dim light of the study superstitions make for excellent cover stories, "but I suspect a more human hand is at work, one driven by greed, jealousy, and a fear of exposure." Lady Constant, who had been watching silently, finally spoke in a trembling tone. "I have always believed that fate was too capricious to account for the patent tragedies that have beset our name. Yet when I gaze upon these omissions, I cannot help but wonder if there was a deliberate effort to hide a murderous streak, a taste for murder perhaps as unseemly as it is inevitable in human nature." Mr. Fenwick bristled, his eyes narrowing. "You imply then that the so-called curse is nothing more than a well-crafted ruse, a means to obscure the sins of those who would benefit from a death?" "Precisely," Miss Marple interjected softly. "When fortune favors those who profit from calamity, one must ask if a supernatural curse is needed at all." She paused, her gaze drifting over the faded ink and blank spaces. "These records suggest a pattern, one where the misfortunes conveniently align with shifts in inheritance. It is as though a particular branch of this family, the one born of shame and omission, has long harbored a propensity for, shall we say, eliminating obstacles to wealth." The study seemed to lean in closer, the quiet hum of the ancient clock punctuating the tension in that room filled with the ghosts of half-remembered histories and hidden branches. The true nature of the Wisterfield legacy was revealed. It was not a curse born of the supernatural but a deliberate if unspoken conspiracy, a lineage marred by a singular appetite for power and blood. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy as she gathered the charts. It appears that true murderers may be found not in legends, but in the living, in the unacknowledged branches of our family tree, a most human curse indeed. And as the fading light gave way to the encroaching night, the study itself seemed to sigh under the burden of its secrets, a quiet testament to the fact that sometimes the darkest truths are hidden in plain sight, among the forgotten names of a family history, deliberately rewritten in a cramped study of a seldom trod corridor of Wisterfield Hall. Time itself seemed suspended amid the yellow genealogical charts and spidery family trees pinned haphazardly to the walls. The space with its heavy drapes and a single green banker's lamp exuded both faded opulence and an oppressive claustrophobe, a fitting setting for secrets long kept and names deliberately erased. Miss Marple stood before a broad oak desk, her gloved fingers lightly brushing over brittle records. She had come here to seek clarity in the tangle of half-truths that defined the Wisterfield legacy. The charts, some meticulously drawn, others hastily annotated with question marks and blank spaces, hinted at an omission that had troubled the family for generations. Lady Constant had earlier alluded to a branch of the family, one born of an illegitimate union, that had been quietly expunged from the official records before Miss Marple could study the charts. The door creaked open instead. A man whose presence seemed to rip the delicate atmosphere, under a distant cousin scarcely recognized in polite circles yet unmistakably bearing the family name, his eyes dark and nervous beneath a furrowed brow, darted about the study, as if expecting hidden eyes to be watching his voice when he spoke, was clipped with barely concealed hostility. "Forgive my interruption," he said, his tone laced with an edge of resentment, "but I must protest this meddling in affairs best left undisturbed." His gaze flicked to the documents, spread before Miss Marple. "Some truths once brought into the light cannot be unlearned." Miss Marple regarded him with a calm that belied the tension crackling in the air. "On the contrary, Mr. Dunnon, if I call you so," she said softly, "knowledge is the first step toward justice. The records reveal omissions. Mr. Dunstan's names are missing where they ought to be. Might you explain that?" The distant cousin's nostrils flared imperceptibly. "There are things in a family's past that are better left forgotten," he snapped. Though his voice faltered, he hesitated before adding in a lower tone, almost to himself, "and some fortunes, what might have been mine, are lost if the past is stirred up." That offhand remark, delivered with a bitter sneer, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. The insinuation hung in the air like a wisp of smoke. "What might have been yours?" she inquired, her tone polite yet pointed. "I trust you are referring to matters of inheritance." He flushed, the color rising in his "Inheritance, fortune, words that carry weight in our family," he said bitterly. "I suppose you've heard that our branch, the one from that illegitimate line, has never been fully acknowledged. Some say we were disowned, not just for scandal but for a taste for murder." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and his eyes darted about as if to ward off unseen reproach. If you look closely, you'll see that every untimely death in the Wisterfields has conveniently benefited someone from our very blood, unrecognized by polite society." Miss Marple's lips curved in a thin smile, a subtle blend of dry wit and quiet determination. "It is an intriguing theory," she remarked, "that a so-called curse might be nothing more than a convenient cover for calculated fortune, a scheme engineered by those with something to gain from tragedy." Her eyes lingered on him, noting every twitch of his jaw and the way his fingers drummed nervously against his coat. "Yet I suspect there is more here than mere rumor. Our records suggest a deliberate excision of a branch that may hold the key to these patterned misfortunes." The tension in the room deepened as Mr. Dunstan's expression shifted from indignation to guarded apprehension. He looked away, then back at the genealogical charts, as if hoping they might offer him a defense. "You think," he began haltingly, "that our family's curse is not supernatural at all, but the handiwork of men driven by envy, greed, and a need to secure what is rightfully theirs." Miss Marple inclined her head slowly, I do, she said, her voice measured and calm. When every tragedy is shadowed by an inexplicable fine and benefit, one must ask, if fate itself has been manipulated by human hands, the absence of certain names in these records speaks volumes. It appears that the family has long concealed a branch whose misfortunes conveniently paved the way for its more respectable, Ares Lady Constant, who had been silently watching from a carved settee in the dim light, interjected softly, "We have always maintained that some matters are best left in obscurity, but perhaps now the truth must come to light." Her eyes, tired, yet resolute, met those of Miss Marple. "I regret that the names of our less favoured kin were expunged, but if such omissions have over time masked a pattern of deliberate misdeeds, well, one must consider that even the cursed may be the victims of their own ambition." Mr. Dunstan's hostility cooled into a pained resignation as he mulled over her words. "What would you have me say?" he asked bitterly. "That the so-called curse is nothing more than a ruse, a means to hide a series of calculated murders, all committed to secure the family fortune." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice soft but laden with certainty. "I believe that is precisely what the evidence suggests. Greed and jealousy can drive a man to heinous acts, and the fear of scandal is a powerful motivator to rewrite history." Her eyes flicked back to the charts, noting the gaps like silent indictments in a family such as this. Every untimely death is an opportunity, a tragic chance to rearrange the balance of wealth and power. A long silence fell over the study as the distant cousin wrestled with his own conflicted emotions. Finally he murmured, Perhaps you are right, Miss Marple. Perhaps it is time that the truth, however bitter, be acknowledged." His voice was low, tinged with regret, and something else, an unspoken ambition, that had driven him into the shadows of his own lineage. As the lamp's feeble light flickered across the scattered records, Miss Marple gathered the charts and records with a quiet resolve. The tangled branches of the family tree, with their deliberate omissions and hidden resentments, now formed a map leading to the heart of the mystery. In that small study, where history was as palpable as the dust in the air, the seeds of suspicion had been sown outside. The old walls of Wisterfield Hall seemed to murmur in agreement. The true curse, it now appeared, was not some spectral hex, but the cold, calculated ambition of a man, or a line of men whose appetite for power had stained the family's legacy. And as Miss Marple stepped out of the study, she carried with her the quiet certainty that every secret has a way of clawing its way into the light, however deeply buried it may be. The library doors had been closed for years, not sealed with hammer and nail, not boarded up like the set of a ghost story, but closed in the way things are when a family would rather forget than remember. The Wisterfields had no use for this room anymore. Dust and time had done the job of a padlock. Now, as Miss Marple stood at the threshold, the heavy oak doors groaned against their hinges, the sound breaking the uneasy silence of the manor. The manor's west wing. The air inside smelled of aged parchment, and something deeper, stale, dry, as if the room had been holding its breath for decades. Saul stood behind her, arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight. "See no real purpose in dredging this up," he muttered. Miss Marple, mild as ever, tilted her head. "Closure often arrives in the form of clarity, Sir Peril, and clarity can be most illuminating." The estate caretaker, a stoop-shouldered man named Mr. Yates, had been the one to turn the key. He did so grudgingly, his fingers lingering too long in the lock, as if hoping for some divine intervention to stop him. His sunried face was impassive, but his posture betrayed him. He didn't like standing in this room, didn't like the way its silence pressed against him. "You'll pardon me if I don't linger, Mom," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Never liked this place much." Miss Marple stepped inside, her sharp blue eyes sweeping the room with an ease that suggested she was not looking at it for the first time, but rather seeing it anew. The Wisterfield library was a grand, high-ceilinged room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of severe-looking ancestors who had presumably done very little reading. A grand fireplace yawned at the far end, its brass fixtures dulled by neglect. A desk heavy with dust sat at the center of the room like an abandoned stage, It was there 50 years ago that Theodore Wisterfield had died, a well-dressed corpse slumped over his desk, an unfinished glass of brandy beside him, a single locked door keeping the mystery intact. A tragic business. Betrayal, muttered his gas. Distant Miss Marple did not reply. Instead she crossed to the desk, her small gloved hand tracing the edge where candle wax had once dripped, hardened and been forgotten. The official story, she murmured, was that Theodore Wisterfield was found here alone, the doors locked, the windows bolted from the inside. Stroke, they said, an unfortunate accident. She let the words settle, but the whispers told another story. Sir Betrayal shifted uncomfortably. The whispers, Miss Marple, are why we have a soul-old curse to contend with. Indeed, she mused, pausing at the nearest window. The latch resisted. Years of disuse had stiffened the mechanism, and for a fleeting moment it was as though the door itself was reluctant to let them in, a protest from the past. Miss Marple pressed a little harder. Click. The sound was small, but in the heavy silence of Wisterfield Hall's forgotten library, it felt like a gunshot. She stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust, aged parchment, and something else, something less tangible. Secrets. Secrets too stubborn to fade. Tell me, Mr. Yates, she called to the caretaker, who stood hesitantly near the threshold, his thin frame tense, as if proximity alone might invite disaster. Has anything in this room changed since the tragedy? Yates exhaled, a slow, heavy breath through his nose. Not a thing, ma'am. His voice was hoarse, roughened by age, and perhaps by the weight of memory. No one's had a mind to move so much as a book. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. How unusual, she murmured, running her gloved fingers lightly across the wooden surface of a nearby desk, feeling the grain beneath the layer of dust. Sir Betrayal, standing stiffly behind her, frowned. Unusual. Miss Marple turned, tapping a slender finger against the window pane. That an old, once-beloved library remains untouched for 50 years, as though someone wanted it left exactly as it was, as though memory itself were best preserved undisturbed. Sir Betrayal hesitated. You believe the room was kept intact, not out of grief, but out of necessity. Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Instead she moved slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail, the thick carpet, the soot-blackened fireplace, the rows upon rows of forgotten books gathering dust on their shelves. But it was the desk that held her attention. I believe, Sir Betrayal, she said at last, that some people find comfort in a story well told, and that the easiest way to avoid a scandal is to let time do the erasing. She ran her gloved hand over the smooth surface of the desk, then stopped. Miss Marple's fingers traced a faint outline in the dust, a perfect rectangle, where something had once sat. There's something missing, she murmured. Sir Betrayal frowned. Missing. This room is untouched. Miss Marple merely smiled, polite but sharp. Look here. She gestured at the desk. Do you see? The dust settles evenly over time, except where an object shields it. She lifted her hand, revealing the clear outline beneath. Something was here, and it's been removed, recently. A flicker of something nervous crossed Yates's face. Could be a book, he muttered. Miss Marple gave him a look that made it clear she was not so easily deceived. A book, she said lightly, or something that ought to have stayed buried. Silence stretched between them. The weight of it was palpable. Then softly she continued. Let us consider for a moment the night of Theodore Wisterfield's death. Miss Marple turned back to the room, painting the picture in her mind. Piece by piece, he was found slumped over his desk. She stepped closer to the chair, as if seeing the body as it had once been. The door was locked from the inside. She moved toward the heavy oak door, running a careful hand along its surface. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. She paused, her voice soft but pointed. And yet, the crime was not only committed, but concealed. Sir Betrayal's voice was hushed. You're saying it was murder? Miss Marple turned, her eyes sharp beneath the modest brim of her hat. I am saying, Sir Betrayal, that the circumstances fit murder far better than they do natural causes. Yates, still lingering near the door, exhaled sharply. You think someone here at the Hall, Miss Marple gave him a look that silenced the thought before it could fully form. I think that the truth, much like dust, has a way of settling in the most inconvenient places. She turned back to the desk, pressing her fingertips lightly against the faded leather blotter, and I believe, she continued, that this room was locked away not to preserve a memory, but to preserve a lie. Sir Perel swallowed, his composure cracking ever so slightly. And if you're right, he asked, if it was murder? Miss Marple dusted off her sleeve, her voice calm, unhurried. Then it stands to reason, Sir Perel, that someone benefited from Theodore Westerfield's death, that someone engineered a tale of curses and misfortune to mask a most human crime. A pause. Then she turned to him with a small knowing smile. Tell me, she said lightly, who stood to gain the most? Sir Perel hesitated. Miss Marple already knew, and the library had just confirmed it. As they stepped back into the corridor, leaving the forgotten room behind, the heavy doors swung shut behind them with a soft but decisive click. It was not the sound of a room sealing itself in grief. It was the sound of a secret that had remained undisturbed for far too long. And now it was waking up. Usual stiff confidence, giving way to something closer to unease. He ran a hand over his create, as though it might steady his nerves. I don't see what can be gained by raking over old embers. Miss Marple, he said, his voice measured but tight. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Old embers have a way of reigniting under the right conditions, Sir Perel. Mr. Yates, the estate caretaker, grumbled, as he stepped past them and dropped a ring of heavy brass keys into his pocket. He had been the one to unlock the doors, though he had not been eager about it. This room's been shut near half a century. Never liked it much then, don't like it now. Miss Marple surveyed the space, her gaze methodical. The desk, solid and imposing, sat at the center of the room. The high-backed chair behind it had long since gathered a fine shroud of dust. Bookshelves towered around them, filled with volumes that had not been disturbed in decades. Heavy drapes framed the single large window, which overlooked the sprawling grounds. It was here, at this very desk, that Theodore Westerfield had died, slumped over with an untouched glass of brandy nearby, a locked door behind him, and no signs of intrusion. The official ruling had been a stroke, but the whispers that followed had told a different story. Miss Marple moved with quiet precision, stepping toward the window. She ran her gloved fingers over the glass, her eyes narrowing at a set of faint scratches along the wooden frame. To most, it would look like nothing to her. It was a question, waiting to be answered. She turned toward Mr. Yates. You mentioned the room had been shut for years, but tell me, has the window ever been open? Opened. The caretaker let out a short laugh. Not a chance. It's bolted, same as the night old Theodore died. Miss Marple pressed lightly against the frame, testing it. Then, with a deft motion, she found what she was looking for, a hidden latch beneath the carved molding. It gave slightly beneath her touch. How very interesting, she murmured. Sibyl frowned. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple straightened. But this locked room may not have been so very locked at all. Perel exhaled sharply. Are you saying someone staged it? I would say, Miss Marple replied lightly, that someone went to a great deal of trouble to ensure it appeared as though Theodore Westerfield died alone in this room, with no means of entry or exit. She gestured toward the scratches. And yet someone was here, someone who ensured they left no obvious trace, except for what time itself has kindly preserved. Mr. Yates shifted uncomfortably. Ain't my business, but if you're right, that's a nasty bit of work. Miss Marple nodded quite. She turned back to the desk, considering the elements that had shaped the legend: a sudden death, a locked door, a name added to the list of family tragedies that conveniently supported the Wisterfield Curse. Superstition, she said mostly to herself, is an excellent det. Sir Perel stared at her. I beg your pardon. She tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. If one wanted to commit a crime, and ensure no one looked too closely, what better way than to make it appear as though it were beyond human interference? She met his gaze. A locked room, death whispered about as a curse. It keeps the truth hidden beneath layers of fear, and legend. Sir Perel ran a hand over his face. You think someone used the Wisterfield Curse as a cover for murder? I think Miss Marple said, her voice deceptively mild, that whoever killed Theodore Wisterfield did so, knowing full well that no one would dare challenge the convenient narrative, a family haunted by misfortune. It's much easier to swallow than the notion that someone, perhaps even someone within these very walls, stood to gain from his death. Silence settled over the room. Sir Perel's expression darkened. And who exactly do you suspect? Miss Marple smiled. Yeah, Sir Perel, isn't that the question? Closing the scene, she turned back to the window lightly, pressing the hidden latch once more. If Theodore Westerfield's death had been staged, then the murderer had been clever exceptionally so, but no crime was perfect, not even one that had been carefully constructed to pass as supernatural. Miss Marple had no doubt. Now the past had not been buried by fate or misfortune, it had been buried by someone who had been very much alive at the time, someone who had taken great care to ensure that no one ever looked too deeply. But the thing about buried secrets was that they had a way of surfacing, and Miss Marple had every intention of digging them up. The sitting room at Wisterfield Hall was not grand like the drawing room, nor imposing like the library. It was a space meant for quiet conversations, discreet dealings, and as Miss Marple suspected, a fair number of family secrets. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows against the velvet drapes. The tension in the room, however, had nothing to do with the flickering light. Miss Marple sat primly in the high back chair nearest the fireplace, hands folded neatly in her lap before her. An array of expectant and some apprehensive faces watched with varying degrees of composure. Sir Perel stood stiffly near the drinks cabinet, a half-poured brandy forgotten in his hand. Lady Constance sat with her back straight, a delicate porcelain cup resting untouched on the table beside her. Mr. Pendleton, the family solicitor, had positioned himself near the door, as if contemplating the best moment to excuse himself. And then there was Mr. Dunstan, the distant cousin, with too many grievances, and too few apologies. He leaned against the mantel jaw, tight fingers drumming against the wood. I thank you all for
gathering. Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as ever,
though the weight in the room suggested something far from polite conversation. It is never easy to confront the past, but I believe we have reached a moment where we must do just that. Sir Perel exhaled sharply. Miss Marple, I assume this has something to do with your investigations into my great-uncle's death. Quite so, Miss Marple said, her expression mild, though as I have suspected for some time. Now his was no mere tragic misfortune, nor was it the work of some supernatural curse, despite what certain legends would have us believe. Lady Constance paled slightly, her hand tightening around the arm of her chair. Are you suggesting the Theodore Wisterfield was murdered? Miss Marple nodded. Murdered, yes, and rather cleverly so. Step-by-step revelation. She glanced at Mr. Pendleton. It was your mention of the family genealogy that first piqued my interest, Mr. Pendleton. A curious set of omissions in the records, names blotted out or simply left unacknowledged. Why, I wondered, would a family so dedicated to lineage choose to forget certain branches of its own tree? Mr. Pendleton shifted uncomfortably. The Wisterfields have always been particular about inheritance, he said cautiously. Miss Marple smiled thinly. Indeed, and yet when one follows the money as I have, it becomes quite clear that some members of the family had much to gain from Theodore Westerfield's demise. She turned to the group at large. What do we know of his death? We know he was found slumped over his desk in the library, the door locked, the windows bolted. We know that no one was seen entering or leaving, a mystery that seemed impossible. Her eyes flicked to Saul. And yet, as we have now discovered, the window had a hidden latch, a very small detail, but one that changes everything. Sir Perel's grip on his glass tightened. You're saying the murderer escaped through the window? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that the scene was staged to appear as though no escape was possible. A lock-room murder is most effective when it appears unsolvable. Lady Constance let out a shaky breath. But why? Who would go to such lengths? Miss Marple turned her gaze to Mr. Dunstan. Perhaps someone who was tired of being a forgotten footnote in the family's history, someone who had everything to gain, and nothing to lose. Dunstan let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. You think I killed him? That's rich. Miss Marple tilted her head. I think you were the most obvious suspect, which is why I considered it too easy an answer. No, the real culprit was someone far more patient, someone who understood how to use both family legend and human superstition to their advantage. She let the silence stretch before continuing. The real murderer was someone who needed Theodore Wisterfield out of the way, someone who had access to the library knowledge of the hidden latch, and most importantly someone who understood that the best way to kill without suspicion was to ensure no one dared to ask questions. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words pressed against the room. The person who killed Theodore Wisterfield was Cess Perrol. A hush fell. The only sound was the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Beyond, Perrol let out a scoff, but his fingers had gone white around the stem of his glass. That's preposterous. Miss Marple shook her head. It's entirely logical. You were the one who stood to inherit the bulk of his estate. Think Theodore Wisterfield was in the process of altering his will. Mr. Pendleton, I believe you can confirm that Mr. Pendleton, who had thus far avoided making direct eye contact with anyone. Sigh. Yes, Theodore had mentioned changing the will, though he never signed the final document.
Because he was dead before he could do so.
Miss Marple said simply. Lady Constance flew to her mouth. Dear God, Miss Marple pressed on the locked room. Illusion was a stroke of genius. Really? Theodore trusted you so. Perrol, he would have accepted a drink from you without suspicion. You poisoned his brandy, then used the window to exit, bolting it behind you from the outside, with a hidden latch. The door remained locked, and when he was found, the conclusion was simple. Either natural causes or the infamous Wisterfield Curse. Perrol let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. And yet here I am, Miss Marple, free with no evidence against me. Miss Marple gave him a small knowing smile. Not quite, Sir Perrol. You see, what criminals often forget is that the past doesn't stay embedded. When I reopened the library, I found something interesting. A single book missing from it. Not valuable, not rare, just out of place, and inside its pages tucked away for all these years was a letter written by Theodore Wisterfield on the night of his death. She reached into her handbag and produced a folded yellowed sheet of paper. It details his suspicions, his belief that someone was plotting against him, and most damning of all, it names you. Perrol's jaw clenched. That letter means nothing. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, though I suspect a jury would think otherwise. The silence that followed was Sol set down his glass with slow deliberation. The fire flickered, casting his shadow large against the wall. Mr. Pendleton cleared his throat. I will of course need to report this to the authorities. Dunstan for once said nothing. Lady Constance closed her eyes as if she had been expecting this for years. Miss Marple, ever composed, rose from her chair, and so at last the Wisterfield Curse is laid to rest, not by ghosts nor by fate, but by the truth. As she stepped toward the door, she glanced back. Once Perrol had not moved, his face, unreadable, his fate but sealed. The truth had come to light. Wisterfield Hall would never be the same. The private sitting room at Wisterfield Hall was not a place for drama. It was meant for polite whispers, for tea taken with careful hands, for matters of discretion. But tonight it held something heavier than any of its gilded decor could withstand. The air was thick with it, the kind of tension that settled into the bones when the past finally caught up with the present. Miss Morell sat primly in an armchair near the fireplace, her lace-gloved hands folded in her lap, the very image of Cal. Across from her the Wisterfields assembled, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright dread. Cess Perrol stood stiffly by the drinks cabinet, where a brandy sat untouched. Lady Constance, PVE still but composed, perched on the edge of a chaise longue. Mr. Pendleton, the ever-pragmatic solicitor, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. And then there was Mr. Dunstan, the black sheep, the distant cousin, the shadow that had always lingered, just outside the family's favor. He slouched in a chair watching Miss Marple with narrowed eyes, and something close to amusement. "I thank you all for coming, Miss Marple," began, her voice pleasant, but firm. "It is of course an unfortunate business to discuss, but the time has come for the truth to be known." Sarsaparil's lip curled. "Must we continue this charade, Miss Morell? My family has endured enough speculation over these so-called tragedies." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Morell said mildly. "Speculation is tiresome, that is why I am here to replace it with facts." The silence stretched tense and expectant, then Miss Marple gestured toward the stack of papers resting on the small side table. "I have here records that have long been forgotten intentionally, so they detail a branch of the Wisterfield family that was never fully acknowledged." She paused, her keen eyes scanning the room. "I'm an illegitimate line, one that should have faded into obscurity, and yet it did not." Dunstan let out a short laugh, but it had no real humor. "You'll think I'm the ghost of a forgotten Wisterfield, come to collect what's mine." Miss Morell smiled. "Oh no, Mr. Dunnon, you are very much flesh and blood, and therein lies the problem, doesn't it?" Dunstan's fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. Miss Morell continued, her voice as even as ever. "For generations the Wisterfield family has been plagued by misfortunes, always a timely death, always an inheritance that shifts in just the right direction, and each time it was blamed on the family curse." Pendle shifted uncomfortably. "Surely you don't mean to suggest I mean to state quite plainly," Miss Morell interrupted, "that the Wisterfield curse has been nothing more than a most convenient illusion, a story crafted to disguise something far less supernatural." She turned back to Dunstan. "Mr. Dunstan, a family tradition, one might say." A murmur rippled through the room. Dunnon sat very still, his face was carefully neutral, but his fingers had stopped drumming. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You were raised outside Wisterfield, weren't you? Always on the outskirts, always told you weren't quite one of them. That must have been difficult." Dunstan's jaw tightened, Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words were sharp as a knife. "Imagine knowing all your life that you belonged here, that it should have been your name on the family tree, that if only fate had played differently, you would have been the one with a title of fortune." And she let the silence hang, then added, "Or perhaps fate just needed a little encouragement." Dunstan let out a slow breath. "You paint a dramatic picture, Miss Marple." She smiled slightly. "I do believe it is you who has written this particular drama. Mr. Dunnon, shall I tell you how?" She gestured to the pile of documents. "Theodore Westerfield's death was no accident. The opposed locked room was a clever ruse, one that only worked because people were so willing to believe in the curse. But we now know that the window had a hidden latch, an exit for a killer who wished to leave no trace." Sarsaparil paled slightly. Miss Morell went on. "More recent deaths have followed the same pattern, quiet, unprovable, convenient."
Her eyes
Flicked back to Dunstan, "and all of them benefited the same individual." Dunstan gave her a slow, sardonic smile. "And what exactly are you accusing me of?" Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Carrying on a most unfortunate family tradition." The room was so still that the faint crackle of the fireplace sounded like a gunshot. Dunstan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply.
"And if I were to admit it?"
"Lady Constant," gasped Sarsaparil, took a step forward, face dark with rage. "You." Dunnon held up a hand. "Don't act so surprised. What do you think? This family was built on love." He gave a short, humorous laugh. "For generations Wisterfields have killed each other to get ahead. The only difference is I finally decided it was my turn." Lady Constance's hand trembled against the arm of her chair. "But why?" Dunstan's smile vanished. His voice was quiet. "Because it should have been mine." Miss Marple studied him, her
expression unreadable.
"And what? Now, Mr. Dunnon, do you expect history to absolve you?" Dunnon looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled and shook his head.
"No," he admitted.
"I suppose not." Pendleton cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Will you notify the authorities?" Dunstan's smirk returned, but it was tired. How fitting the silence stretched as everyone absorbed the weight of what had just been revealed. The Wisterfield Curse unraveled, exposed for what it had always been. Miss Marple rose from her chair, adjusting her gloves, and so the past catches up with us all. But at least now the Wisterfields can rest without ghosts, only truth. As she stepped toward the door, she glanced back once at Dunstan. He wasn't smiling anymore. The curse was broken, but the legacy of greed, of ambition turned to murder. That was something no family tree could ever erase. The makeshift inquest room in the local magistrate's office smelled of old paper and damp wool, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked coats. The room itself was unremarkable. Plain wood, paneled walls, a few stiff-backed chairs and a long table where a magistrate sat, his expression carved from the same stone as the courthouse steps outside. He listened, with patient disinterest, as the facts of the Wisterfield case unfolded before him, occasionally making a note in his thick ledger. Dunstan sat opposite, flanked by two uniformed officers, his hands resting too casually on the table. There was no fight left in him, just the remains of a smoke, worn thin like an old playing card. He had played the game, and lost. Miss Marple sat quietly, a faint smile touching her lips whenever the magistrate gave her a curious glance. The quiet spinster from St. May had managed to do what generations of Wisterfields had failed to dispel the illusion of the family curse. Perel sat rigid beside Lady Constant, his fingers laced tightly together. His face was drawn, the weight of the revelations having aged him overnight beside him. Lady Constant was pale, but composed, the same quiet grace she had always carried, now temper with something more vulnerable, relief perhaps, or the hollow realization that the past had not been quite as she'd believed. Pendleton, the ever-recipient solicitor, read from his notes but summarized. It is clear that the so-called Wisterfield Curse was a deliberate fabrication designed to disguise generations of calculated murders. Mr. Doonan, he cast a sharp glance across the table, used this legend to his advantage, ensuring that his crimes would be attributed to superstition rather than suspicion. Dumpster let out a quiet chuckle. Can't say it didn't work for a while. The magistrate frowned at him. You do well to take these proceedings seriously. Sir Dunstan's smirk faded. He leaned back, expression unreadable. Oh, I take them very seriously, your worship. Just funny, that's all. How much people will believe, if it means they don't have to look too closely. Miss Marple spoke, then her voice light, yet firm. Yes, well, that is the thing about stories, Mr. Dunstan. Sooner or later, someone comes along who prefers facts. The magistrate nodded solemnly, before turning to the officers. I believe we are quite done here. Proceed with the necessary charges. Dunstan rose slowly, flexing his fingers, as though testing invisible restraints. He turned once towards Ursel and Lady Constance. I suppose this is the part where you claim you never suspected a thing. Sir Perel said nothing. Lady Constance swallowed hard, before answering. I suppose this is the part where you tell us you never cared. Dunham tilted his head, considering. Oh, I cared, just not in the way you'd have liked. With that he was led away, leaving behind nothing but a memory, a bitter echo of the Wisterfields' dark legacy. The carriage ride back to Wisterfield Hall was silent. The storm that had threatened earlier had finally broken, the rain now falling in steady drizzles against the misted windows. Sir Perel stared out at the bleak countryside, his mind elate. It's strange, he murmured at last. All my life, I believed in the curse, feared it, let it dictate every decision. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat, and to think it was nothing more than greed, dressed in folklore. Lady Constant, her hands folded in her lap, sighed. It is one thing to believe in fate, Perel, quite another to realize men have been playing at gods. She turned to Miss Marple, offering a weary smile. Don't know how to thank you. Miss Marple patted her gloved hands together. Oh my dear, no thanks are necessary. One does what one must. Pendleton, sitting opposite, cleared his throat. What happens now? Then the hall's reputation has been, well, let's say, muddied. Miss Marple gave a wry smile. Oh, I imagine Wisterfield Hall will survive. Grand estates always do in one way or another. It's people that suffer when secrets fester. Pearl let out a heavy breath. I suppose we rebuild then. Lady Constance turned back toward the window, watching the rain mist over the hills. Or perhaps, she said softly, we simply begin again. A week later the news had faded. The scandal had been printed, speculated upon, and then promptly replaced by fresher gossip. Wisterfield Hall had become just another legend, the kind that village women whispered about over garden fences. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary, me as unceremoniously as she had left, stepping off the train with her single valise, greeted only by the crisp morning air and the familiar sights of home. By the time she reached her cottage, the comforting smell of freshly brewed tea welcomed her. She set her things down, removed her hat, and settled into her favorite chair. Outside the world continued as it always had. Mrs. Hartley would soon pass by with her Pomeranian fretting over the price of sugar. The vicar's wife would stop in for tea, eager for any hints of Miss Mar's latest adventure. Yes, life went on, and as Miss Marple sipped her tea, a small smile played at her lips. Wisterfield Hall was free from its ghosts, at least the ones of human design. Another puzzle solved, another story neatly concluded. She reached for her knitting, content to let the world spin on without her until the next time fate or folly sent another mystery her way. The inquest room in the local magistrate's office was as unremarkable as a place of justice could be. Four walls that had heard every kind of lie, a single wooden table scarred with the weight of 100 desperate pleas outside. Rain tapped against the tall windows, setting a steady rhythm against the murmurs of those assembled. Dunstan sat in the defendant's chair, his hands resting lightly on the tabletop, his expression somewhere between resignation and defiance. The performance was over, and he had played his final act well enough. He watched the proceedings with the air of a man who had already counted his losses. Sir Perron sat beside Lady Constance, his face drawn tight, his posture stiff, as if he could will away the weight of history pressing down on him. Lady Constance, for all her pose, seemed suddenly older, as if stripping the legend from the family, had taken some of her own substance with it. Pendleton, ever the legal mind, spoke in measured tones as he summarized the evidence. The accused manipulated a long-standing family superstition to cover his actions. The so-called Wisterfield Curse, once thought to be an unfortunate legacy, has been nothing more than a convenient disguise for murder. Miss Marple listened with her usual air of quiet certainty, hands folded neatly in her lap. The magistrate, a non-nonsense man with a weary gaze, glanced at her more than once as the truth of the case unfolded. A nod here, a confirming glance there. She did not need to speak. The facts spoke well enough for Dunstan. Exhaled slowly, the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. His gaze flickered toward Sir Perron, measuring him, perhaps even pitying him. I wonder, he mused, voice tinged with something unreadable, if you ever suspected the truth, or did you prefer the comfort of believing in curses? Sir Perron did not flinch. His reply was steady, though there was something hollow beneath the surface. I preferred to believe my family wasn't capable of such things. Dunstan let out a dry chuckle, devoid of amusement. That was your first mistake. The magistrate sighed, heavy with finality, and tapped his gavel against the table. I believe we've heard enough. His gaze shifted to the officers standing by the door. Proceed with the necessary charges. The guards stepped forward. There was no struggle, no protest, only the soft clink of shackles locking into place. Dunstan straightened, smoothing the front of his coat, and turned toward Miss Marple. His lips twitched, almost into something resembling admiration. I suppose I should thank you, Miss Marple, he said, tilting his head. You saw through the story that everyone else was too afraid to question. She regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with quiet certainty, she spoke. Stories are useful things, Mr. Dunstan, but the truth always outlives them. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, sealing the last breath of the Wisterfield Curse. The rain had not let up by the time Miss Marple returned to Wisterfield Hall to collect her things. The estate loomed against the storm-darkened sky, its ivy-clad walls damp with mist. But something had changed. It was no longer a place of ghosts. The house had been steeped in whispers, in shadows that clung to the corridors, in the weight of unanswered questions that had turned into superstition. But now the air felt lighter, not empty. History could never be erased, but rewritten. Near the entrance, the household staff had gathered. The butler, ever composed, gave her a respectful nod. The housekeeper, usually stern, murmured a soft "safe travels, ma'am." Even the gardener, a man with little patience for words, tipped his hat. Sir Perral stood beside Lady Constance at the door. There was something in his eyes, something uncertain. "You have done us a great service, Miss Marple," he said quietly. Then, with rare honesty, he admitted, "though I confess I am not certain what comes next." Miss Marple smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried both kindness and finality. "You live, Sir Perral," she said gently, "without shadows, without ghosts. That is what comes next." Lady Constance pressed her gloved hands together, her voice almost a whisper. "I had always thought the past to be immovable," she admitted. Then with a thoughtful breath she added, "But now it seems lighter." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is remarkable what a little clarity can do." With that she stepped into the waiting carriage. The door shut with a soft click. The wheels began to turn, carrying her away from Wisterfield Hall, from the whispers of curses and conspiracies, back towards something simpler. She did not look back. Not until the hall had nearly disappeared into the mist. When she finally allowed herself a last glance over her shoulder, the house remained as grand and inscrutable as ever, but for the first time in a long while, it no longer looked haunted. By the time Miss Marple arrived back in St. Mary Mead, the rain had cleared. The village, as always, was much the same, a place untouched by scandal, yet endlessly curious about it. The hedgerows were neatly trimmed. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from cottage windows. A few familiar faces waved as she passed. The world, it seemed, had continued as it always had. She reached her doorstep just as the sky softened into a pale blue. The storm had passed. With quiet efficiency, she let herself inside, setting her travel bag neatly by the umbrella stand. Her hands moved with practiced ease, familiar, unhurried, unshaken by the ghosts she had left behind. She moved to put the kettle on. Outside, life continued. Mrs. Hartley would soon pass by with her yapping Pomeranian, her voice high with gossip. The vicar's wife would stop in, eager to press for details about Miss Marple's latest adventure. Miss Marple settled into her chair, picking up her knitting. A small knowing smile touched her lips. Curses, she reflected, were nothing more than stories that people told themselves, to make sense of the things they did not wish to understand. But the truth, she pulled the thread through the yarn, satisfied. The truth was always there, waiting. Another puzzle solved, another legend laid to rest, and as always, there would be more mysteries waiting. But for now, there was tea.